Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 177. The Kennedy Murrays. Part 2, Kennedy Murray Sr.
Who was Kennedy Murray Sr. and where did he come from?
Well, a lot of the family wasn't sure where he came from, so there was a lot of rumours, and there was a story that Kennedy Murray himself put around, and the family put around actually for 200 years that proved to be not correct, but not far off the truth, in fact, was that he was somehow related to the 3rd Duke of Atholl at Blair Castle. But in fact, he came from Ayrshire, south of Glasgow. So a lot of the family had been searching, but nobody had really kind of been clear except for one thing. So some of the family had dug up a baptism record. The baptism record was for August 1771, referring to a father by the name of John Murray and a mother by the name of Elizabeth Calder, and that he was born in a place called Dundonald, which is 20 kilometres south of Glasgow, and it's very close to Kilwinning. The baptism record had several interesting elements to it. One is that it referred to how his parents, John and Elizabeth, were actually servants of the household of Lady Susanna Montgomery, the Countess of Eglinton. Baptism record also referred to how Kennedy Murray had been begotten in antenuptial fornication. And nobody really picked up on that before in the family. So I did further research, and I had to explain the term, which is only commonly used by the Scottish Presbyterians, mainly in the 18th century. If this event actually happened, it had to be put on the baptism record. I then found a marriage certificate for John and Elizabeth, which was for, I think, February the 15th, 1771. So if you do your maths, they got married, and then a little bit over 5 months and a bit, Kennedy's born. It was confirmed also that antenuptial fornication, or having to mention that, referred to a marriage where the bride turns up pregnant.
So how did Kennedy Murray Sr. get his distinctive name?
He got it, I believe, in honour of Lady Susanna, the Countess of Eglinton, who actually was not only a Kennedy, she was the daughter of the clan chief of the Kennedy family and the Kennedy Castle just south of Kilwinning. And Elizabeth Calder was a Kennedy, so we are aware that she came into the household as a cousin. And what the Countess subsequently did to assist John and Elizabeth was something that nobody would simply do to somebody who was not a relative. So the Countess went to a lot of trouble. She was a close friend of the local Scottish Reverend Thomas Walker. In fact, there's a little bit of a story that she was helping Thomas Walker's son get an entry into the Glasgow University at the time. Anyway, they're very close, and so we know that Thomas Walker did several things to assist a difficult situation because they couldn't deny it. But what they did is Lady Susanna organised the wedding of her cousin to John Murray, who had also worked for the Eglingtons for, I believe, 150 years, at Irvine, which is a nearby parish. It wasn't held in the local parish, which was probably to avoid embarrassment, etc. And then there was a second event which took place 2 weeks after the baptism. It was required practice in the Scottish Presbyterian Church to have a Kirk session to question and usually to absolve the married couple. So John Murray had to turn up. Some of this is written about in my book. Was asked to not so much explain himself, but to give the opportunity to apologise, which he did. And so at the end of the session, it was said that he and Elizabeth had been absolved. In other words, it was something that was a bit of an issue for the church, but the thing was they weren't trying to kick anybody out. Nobody went to jail. As long as you came to the Kirk session and said that it was an accident, now we're going to behave and be a good Christian family, then the matter's finished. I was also later able to identify 2 other later children in the family, who were named John and James, so they continued the traditional pattern after Kennedy had been born. But I believe that Kennedy was named in these extraordinary circumstances and honour, if not Lady Susanna directly, their common Kennedy connection to his mother. Lady Susanna was in her 80s at this stage when all this was happening, and she died 10 years later in 1781 at the age of 90, which was amazing. And a couple of years later, I've been able to establish that John and Elizabeth took their 3 sons back to Bridgetown in Glasgow. But that was about the time that Glasgow and Edinburgh were 2 of the first big modern cities with growing poverty problems because of the highland clearances and a lot of people from the countryside or the industrialisation going to live in the big cities. And that was the time that Kennedy and the family had to go back because I believe there's no longer the patronage of Lady Susanna. Some other family members took over her castle, Orkins Castle at Dundonald. And that was the background to what happens next.
At this stage, their family have been quite protected. So now we're probably getting to the clue as to why Kennedy Murray Sr. arrived in Australia.
We do indeed. Family were in different circumstances after leaving Dundonald and Bridgetown and were struggling. So what we know next is that in 1785 was when Kennedy got into trouble with a group of boys who seemed to be street children in Glasgow. The way I put it in the book is that he clearly went off the rails. So there were 2 episodes. One was December 1785, where there was a first instance reported in the newspapers, something that was robbing a shop. There was a second episode involving Kennedy only in June 1786, where he was found to be the person who had obtained some items that had been stolen from a guest house or a visiting travelling salesman. And he was later identified. Whether he was a person who stole those items or received them, we're not sure. So he was charged a second time in June 1786. There was a pre-trial hearing in mid-August. A third son was actually the cousin that turned up that helped me to connect it all together. That there was a mysterious Alex Murray who turned up at the court in 1786 to pay a bond. And I was eventually able to identify that that was an Alex Murray, a cousin from Dundonald, who was 26 years of age at the time. At that hearing, Alex Murray turns up with a solicitor, and he also turns up with some money, quite a lot of money, because he paid a substantial bond. The solicitor actually made a petition. Kennedy Murray didn't want to go to trial, and he was never convicted formally. He put a petition that was accepted by the court, and that is that he wanted to be petitioned to leave the UK because he didn't think he could live there anymore. There was no place for him and he wanted to leave. Quite amazing when you think about it. So a petition was put up, and when I think September the 19th was when the trial was supposed to be, and it never proceeded. It was simply that the court accepted his petition and he effectively received a 14-year sentence as a banishment rather than as a conviction. And so he stayed for some years in the Glasgow toll booth waiting. Now, around about that time, very interesting, is that transportation up until that point had meant transportation to the American colonies, but it was just after the American War of Independence. So it was during these years that the English government, the Pitt government, were actually projecting settling Australia. We know that the English government ultimately decided they didn't want free settlers to come and make another independent colony, so they made sure that it was made up as a convict colony. So Kennedy should have been on the first fleet, 1786, so 1788, a couple of years later. I don't know whether it was the logistics of getting down to Portsmouth, where a lot of the ships to Australia actually took off from, but he didn't actually arrive in Portsmouth until 1791. He spent about 3 years at the Glasgow toll booth. Late 1789, he was taken to Leith in Edinburgh, got a ship down to Portsmouth. He then spent about a year or 2 on a prison hulk in Plymouth, moved from Portsmouth to Plymouth, and then back for another year or so at Portsmouth. He was then put on the ship, the Pitt, that was on the 4th Fleet, or the mid-1791, and that was the ship that he came out on. It also happened to have, purely by coincidence, a guy called John Piper, who ended up being the governor of Norfolk Island, who was actually from one of the next villages in Ayrshire. It was after John Piper that Piper's Point in Sydney was named, of course. So John Piper was on that ship, and I believe that because they were the first Scottish convicts and first Scottish to come to Australia, and I'm pretty sure they developed a connection there. Lieutenant Gross, who replaced Governor Phillip as the second governor of Australia, was also on that ship. So it was quite an auspicious ship that Kennedy actually came out on. So he left July 1791 and arrived in the 14th of February in Sydney. It's almost 6 years in terrible conditions. He arrived in Sydney and then he spent 4 years on the prison farm at Toongabbie, which must have seemed a bit like a holiday camp after what he'd been through the previous 6 years.
In some historical accounts, William Kennedy Sr. has been coined the colonial cad. Cameron's going to discuss this notion of the colonial cad and put forward his ideas as to why he feels that this may be an unfair description of William Kennedy Sr.
Now, Cameron, would you like to fill us in why we've made it a question mark?
Yes, and I think I should preface this by referring to 2019 episode of Who Do You Think You Are of Series 10, which features Roger Corser. He's another Kennedy Murray descendant. So it features Kennedy Murray and basically tells a bit of the story of Norfolk Island with a view that the Kennedy Murray left not just one, but two partners or wives in the lurch and cleared off. I found that both claims are not true. Kennedy Murray's first partner, she actually got married before she met Kennedy to a sailor from the Sirius. He was actually, and after a few years, Norfolk Island, struggling to farm there, he just cleared off, never came back. So this notion of a colonial cad is this sort of pattern of women often being left in the lurch with their partners disappearing. Kennedy Murray Sr.'s partner on Norfolk Island was his common-in-law wife, Anne White, and the second was Anne Parker, who he married at Windsor in 1814. So Kennedy Murray arrives in Norfolk Island in 1796. My research shows, because Anne White had, and her first partner, John Scott, had a farm grant in the middle of the island of Norfolk Island, and it's very hard to see how they could have sustained a farm there. A lot of the farms at Norfolk Island were very difficult. Norfolk Island was settled a week after Botany Bay because of food security and became the second settlement of Australia. It was known to be a very fertile island. There was native flax that was seen there by Captain Cook, and the pine trees was thought to be suitable for shipbuilding, which proved to be later false. So that was why they moved back to Fort Phillip, and then within a week of arriving at Botany Bay, they had sent ships to settle Norfolk Island. Anne White, the wife, had turned up on the end of 1791. Anne White married John Scott. The administration decided they'd marry all the women off so that the men had to get the food for them. That was not repeated. All the people on Norfolk Island really had a fairly free run of things. They were not locked up. They basically were able to farm, often got their own farms. So when Kennedy Murray turned up, Toongabbie hadn't been too bad and Norfolk Island was much better. And my research indicates that he was involved in the Common Gardens, which is in the Arthur Vale, just outside the Kingston, which was the main town on Norfolk Island. And it's very fertile with the stream running through it and perfect for market gardens. And after Anne White was left by John Scott, I believe that she came back and a lot of the other families and women lived in Kingston, which was initially Sydney. Then they changed Port Phillip to Sydney, and Sydney on Norfolk Island became Kingston. Kennedy Murray and her, I believe, started a relationship, maybe worked together, maybe met in the Arthur Vale Common Gardens. They then must have started to cohabit and live together, or at least after Kennedy Murray Jr. was born in 1799. And then 2 years later, a second child, a daughter, Elizabeth, was born April 1802. Now, this is where there's several mysteries and controversies that I've had to try and unfold. The first one was that Kennedy Murray actually had officially finished his required time at Her Majesty's pleasure in January 1802, but he was kept on stores. If you go to Norfolk Island, they have a research centre. If you ask about, and quite a few of the family have, they get told that Kennedy Murray departed the island in 1802, around about the time that his daughter was being born. However, there's a number of things that together show that this is false. Kennedy Murray Sr. re-entered Australia as a free settler. So on towards all the musters for the next 25, 30 years is shown as a free settler entering Australia in Sydney on the brig Harrington in 1804, run by Captain Campbell. The brig Harrington, run by a colourful captain, who seems to have had his main occupation in between going to South America during the Spanish UK War and taking over a number of ships and sailing them back to Sydney, was also very much in the illegal drink trade. So he had a lot of trips to India, to Calcutta, and a lot of trips to Norfolk Island, which research shows to be one of the centres up until the early 19th century, where the New South Wales Rum Corps were getting all their illegal spirits. Every year previously there'd been brig Hamilton had come to Norfolk Island, except for 1804. So I eventually found that it had gone to Calcutta at the end of 1803, but did not come back to Sydney 1804. There's no record of it entering. So there's record of it going to Norfolk Island in late 1803, but not coming back in 1804. Kennedy came back on that trip in early 1804, as he consistently said for 30 years, and you would not lie about something like that. So he jumped on the ship in late 1803 after having spent an extra 2 years or so with Anne and the family, and then decided to come back to the mainland to seek a farm. So he either got on the ship and went to Calcutta and came back, or they didn't keep a record, which may explain the fact that bringing back illegal spirits was why there was no record of it coming back in early 1804. It was known that Norfolk Island from years earlier had become too expensive, too difficult. The British government wanted to close it down. And so people that were finishing their emancipists were looking to come back to New South Wales, and they were being told they could apply for some free land grants. So Kennedy Murray came back to do that, and we know that in the Sydney Gazette for April 1805, he is named, along with, we believe, his family, had been given approval by King to be the first settlers in Tasmania. About a year or two after the convicts and soldiers had set up the Derwent colony, was at Risdon Cove, Kennedy Murray was in the first group of free settlers coming to settle on the Derwent. It refers to approval for the family of Kennedy Murray as well. So the Kennedy Murrays was approved, where other people approved as settlers who were single were named singly. So we know he left in April 1805. The question is, when did he find out that his wife, after he'd left in the ship, 6 months later, Anne White had started a relationship with Richard Sides, the head of the local blacksmith, and had come as a convict to Norfolk Island. But by the end of 1804, Anne White was pregnant and having a first child with Richard Sides. They had 5 children and lived there. So it was in 1811 that Macquarie came up with the idea of resettling the last Norfolk Islanders at Norfolk Plains in Van Diemen's Land and organising the surveying of 50 small farms in 1812 just south of Launceston. Before the Blue Mountains was crossed, he saw as the next future food basket of the Australian colony. So we have this little bit of a situation where Anne starts a second family, and Kennedy goes to Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land as it was called, to the Derwent, the first colony. And the next record that we hear is that he's actually given a land grant at Evan, near today's Penrith, in 1809. And that's the next official record that he's back in New South Wales. A couple of years later, we know, and there's a great irony in this, that he had met and started a relationship with an emancipated convict called Anne Parker in the Windsor area. And they had been together a year or two, and Anne had got a free land grant in the Windsor area, which they settled on because the Evan farm must have been too difficult. But around Windsor, it was very fertile, and Kennedy spent a number of years building up a small farm there. Kennedy marries Anne Parker on the 14th of March, 1814. And that's the very same day that in Launceston, Anne White married Richard Sides. So the last number of years, there's nobody to marry them on the island. Well, the time they come to Launceston, a visiting reverend married them. So Anne White, after coming back on the Lady Nelson in 1813 with Richard Sides and their family, and in fact on the same small boat was actually Elizabeth Lowe. She was on the first fleet. It came out at the age of 13 on the Lady Penryn. She'd had 3 relationships by the time she came back on that ship, including George Collins, about the same age as Kennedy Murray Jr. And they were lifelong best friends, neighbours 3 times in Norfolk Island, Launceston and Evandale. So it's a very auspicious date in the family history, the 14th of March, 1814. It's caused havoc that there is an 1820 application by Kennedy Murray for another land grant in New South Wales, because Kennedy Murray Jr. made his applications to Lachlan Macquarie. So the family have believed that the 1820 land grant was made by the son, but not by the father. But it was actually the father in early 1820 who applied for another land grant because he'd spent 7 or 8 years with the Windsor farm of his wife's land grant building a farm. He must have had a cottage there, but we have records of every year what he was producing, and he was growing crops and a few pigs. It had been approved by Macquarie, because this is 2 years after the son applied for his first grant back in Launceston. It was at this stage that terrible tragedy clearly happened. So it was August, September that Anne Parker gets institutionalised in the Castle Hill Lunatic Asylum. And she then stays locked up for 42 years as the longest asylum inmate in Australia in the 19th century. But she went through a series of asylums. Meanwhile, Kennedy moves back to Windsor and had become a lodger in a house owned by Archibald Bell, who had just been appointed the new magistrate to take over from William Cox. And both played a significant role in both the father and son's lives over the next 30 or 40 years, and in fact, grandchildren. Archibald Bell, who was the main commandant in the Hawkesbury area, was actually part of the group of soldiers who arrested Bligh, the rebellion against William Bligh. However, because he then refused to sign petitions in favour of the main instigators of the rebellion, a bit like William Cox, they were then sort of favoured under Macquarie and got appointments and promotions, which other people didn't. Kennedy Murray actually rents lodgings from Archibald Bell. He's only been there about 4 weeks, and there's a story which is in a newspaper article about the stolen chickens. And what happened was this. The main instigator was a Joseph Ward. Around about midnight in the Bell compound, one of the staff and the son, William Bell, they heard a commotion, confront an intruder and find that he's got 2 dead chickens in his bag. Now, for some reason, they think that Kennedy Murray might have been involved. So they go around to Kennedy Murray's lodgings, and there is another lodger there with the children. So there's 4 children under 10 years of age. And the lodger says the children were all hungry. So Kennedy, he went out to look for some food. So both he and Joseph Ward get charged with the theft of 2 stolen chickens. A month later, it goes to court. Joseph Ward is convicted and has to spend 12 months in the Newcastle jail, which was quite a nasty jail. It then, in that article, says that Kennedy Murray has been remanded or hadn't gone to court and maybe at a future date. But there's no more mention of Kennedy Murray getting any further conviction or any matter about the stolen chickens. What there is references to is that the Bell family are involved in looking after the eldest son, John, for the next 7 or 8 years. I believe that there's further evidence that the family adopted John. I think this is consistent with what we know about Archibald Bell, a good family man, a good Christian. He must have taken pity on Kennedy that 4 young children to look after as a single man. His wife has just been put into a mental institution. 3 years later, so Kennedy was obviously persevering and struggling to look after 4 young boys. Youngest being 1 year old when they moved to Windsor. Oldest, John, when they moved, was about 8 or 9. They are put into the newly opened Cabramatta Orphan School. Now, only the 3 youngest sons are put in. They didn't accept John, so John had to live with the Bells. We still have some of the documentation of the entry, and Kennedy Murray wasn't there. So I believe that some of the Bell family, possibly the daughter Elizabeth, may have been the one to help to sign the documentation. When referring to the father, the documentation says that he has been institutionalised also into a mental institution. So they had to say perhaps fully orphaned, or they would not be accepted. A number of years later, William is indentured out to John Blaxland, the brother of Gregory Blaxland, who was one of the 3 men, found a pathway through the Blue Mountains, but it was not they that went across, it was George Evans, who comes up in the story later, on a road built by, he did the survey and was the first man across the mountains after Evandale is named, and William Cox actually built the road. Cox and Evans were actually neighbours at Windsor, and I know that Cox would have known Kennedy Murray, and James Cox, who turns up in Evandale and sponsors Kennedy Murray Jr.'s first land grant, rescues George Evans from the 1806 flooding on the Hawkesbury River. So we have this very, very close little network. To come back to the children, one son, Henry, dies after another year. They mentioned with brain fever. But two of the other sons are indentured out. So there's James, the youngest, and William is the second oldest. And William ends up being indentured John Blaxland. And then he works for the Nortons, a friend of the Cox family at Mulgoa. And he spends a number of years there before Henry George Cox, who was a neighbour at Mulgoa, and his wife was Elizabeth Bell, who was actually the daughter of Archibald Bell, who I believe to have looked after the children for those 3 years that they were based there at Windsor before they went into the Cabramatta Orphan School. They invite William, by this stage he'd been married and had a number of his own children, to come out to near Mudgee. Their farm was called Burrandullah, and William worked there for some years before he arranged a deal with the Coxes to get land to build the first pub in that area. In the 1828 muster, John and Kennedy and another Anne, listed as housekeeper but possibly a third partner or wife, are living at Coaster's Retreat, which is at the mouth of the Hawkesbury River, opposite Palm Beach, Pittwater. In fact, there are actually cottages shown on a survey map, which I've included in my book, near Bonnydoon Wharf today, which is where he had 2 or 3 cottages that he had apparently inherited from shell miners that came up from Sydney to get the shells in the area to use as mortar for Lachlan Macquarie's building program 10 or 15 years earlier. Now, why are they at Coaster's Retreat? We do know from my research, John stays in New South Wales, and I eventually found a death record that identifies him drowning in Sydney Cove in 1843, but it names that he was a waterman. And around about this time, I read Kate Grenville, a very famous writer. Kate Grenville was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2006 for The Secret River. The Secret River began as a history book into her own ancestors who farmed along the Hawkesbury River around about this time. Her ancestor was actually a waterman that was involved in the illegal distillery trade. And so she has quite a bit in the book about that the main occupation along the river were all these settlers with secret distilleries for the Sydney market. My theory is that Kennedy Murray had spent a lot of the preceding 7 or 8 years in the area and must have been aware of this and may have been involved in this. And in fact, not only was involved in farming in Norfolk Island, but had come back on a ship run by one of the biggest illegal spirits smugglers in early Australia, Captain Campbell. So my theory is that he had an illegal distillery is my theory on why he ended up there. And the fact that we know that John was a waterman, and the watermen were the ones that had boats that would go up and also take up to Sydney Cove, as well as up to Windsor, the illegal spirits. And they would also often take the produce, wheat, barley, etc., being used for illegal distilleries, also from some farmers up to some of the other illegal distilleries. We know that that's the area that Kennedy ended up, and that's what I believe how he made a bit of a living for 4 or 5 years, perhaps with John as working with him and being the waterman. Suddenly there's a blank, and the next thing we know, Kennedy Murray Sr. ends up in Evandale. Is how did Kennedy Murray get in contact with his son? In later years, while Kennedy Murray Sr. was at Windsor, we have records of letters being sent, and this was quite common in those days for those that were literate, and Kennedy Murray was not literate, so there's an extra dimension to this. Letters turning up at the post office, so that we know that there were letters waiting for Kennedy Murray. Who sent them? My theory about that is that the connection to the Coxes and then the Bells, possibly William Cox and James Cox. So James Cox, he was a friend of Thomas Archer, who was a very famous settler in the Longford area, pioneer of the Tasmanian sheep industry. And they were very close friends in the Sydney commissary offices. So James went on a visit to see Thomas and decides to stay. And because his father is working very closely with Lachlan Macquarie, he suddenly gets the first of a series of very large land grants, as did Thomas. Around 1814, James Cox meets the son and becomes the main person supporting the son's application for land grant in 1818. Now, my theory is that James Cox probably knew of Kennedy Murray and turned up and recognised this son has the same name. When Kennedy Murray Sr. came to move to Van Diemen's Land and to rejoin his son in 1831, where he spent the rest of his life at Prosperous House. I believe those networks of communications are pretty active at those times, and I believe that's how the connection between the New South Wales Murray family and the Van Diemen's Land Murray family were going before the 1820s and continue to go for many decades later. Kennedy Murray turns up at Prosperous village and joins the Prosperous household of his firstborn son, and he spends the rest of his life there.
The next part is going to cover Kennedy Murray Jr. and his life in Tasmania. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.